Mr. Doctoroff, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. Many of New York's major financial institutions have relocated to other states, in particular Florida, Texas, Tennessee, etc., for a myriad of reasons. The same trend is also present for the city's population, as almost 3.6 million people left New York City last year. What's the impact of this exodus, and is there any way to reverse it?
Uh, Thanks. Yeah. So first of all, you've got to, I think, separate out what's happened during COVID, much of which I suspect will be temporary. And we'll talk about what has to happen to make sure it doesn't become permanent. The question of sort of longer term losses, it's true, New York was starting to lose population starting in about 2017, and we lost maybe about 100,000 people over that 2-year period of time. That's a worrying trend, and we are going to have to address it, because what's really important for a city is that a city grows, because what happens when a city grows is you generate more revenue. When you generate more revenue, you can afford to invest in quality of life, and it just attracts more people, perpetuating a virtuous cycle. And so we're going to have to really focus on growth, but we're going to have to do it in a way that makes people feel like they're going to trust that the benefits of growth are distributed fairly. And that's going to really be the key as we look to the future.
Right. Okay. Well, I mean, outside of, you said yourself, outside of COVID-19, et cetera, we've seen a lot of other factors. And one of those, especially in recent years, seems to be crime. Now, your administration and the Giuliani administration had huge progress reducing violent crime throughout New York City. But in the past 2 years, we've seen that trend shift. In 2020 alone, murders were up 41% over 2019, 53% over 2018. So I think two things here. First, what went wrong between 2018 and now, and how should the next mayoral administration look to deal with this new crime wave? We can get to the second thing in a bit.
Yeah, I'd be careful not to characterize it as a crime wave, first and foremost. Crime has been dropping for about 25 years, and it's only in the last couple that crime went up, and really only in a couple of categories, which are very visible and very important: murders and shootings. Overall crime last year actually did not go up when you take into account all the categories of major crime. That said, it's really worrisome.
Yeah.
And I think what we have seen is a changing dynamic, particularly in the wake of some changes in the way in which we manage crime. But we also have to take into account the fact that if we look at our criminal justice system, it is probably racially biased in lots of different ways. And so the trick for the new mayor, the trick for the new district attorney will be to find that right balance between making people feel safe and managing crime effectively, but doing it in a way that is fair. And there are lots of new, different approaches to actually doing that. And I do believe that as New Yorkers look to the election, particularly the primary election in June, one of the most important things that they need to look for are people who talk both about reducing crime and administering the criminal justice system fairly.
Okay, so yeah, it's that balance that's really key. Now that does actually lead well into my second question here, which was going to be about balance. We've spoken a lot about the importance of economic recovery, but we still have to deal with crime. So between looking at recovering economically, between reforming the criminal justice system, and as you said, making people feel safe, should one of these be prioritized over the other? Do you think one is kind of more important as we look to rebuilding New York, or do we need kind of an equilibrium between these different aspects of building back New York?
Well, I don't think it's just about crime and economic growth or activity. I think we have to grow, that's for sure, but we have to do it in a way that is inclusive, that makes people feel like they benefit from growth. And, over the last several decades, I think the perception has grown that the benefits of growth have not been distributed fairly. So what do we have to do in order to create true inclusive growth? We have to think about education. We've made a lot of progress in our educational system. It's stalled over the last few years, but we also recognize that our schools are highly segregated. So how do we address that? Healthcare, we saw during COVID that disproportionately people of color and people with less means have been dramatically impacted in a disproportionate way. And so is there a new approach to healthcare that is possible? Think about even things like getting around the city. The distances that people have to travel, particularly from, the farther parts of Queens and Brooklyn, are a real inhibitor to opportunity, to spending time with children. How can we make our transportation system actually more effective? In addition to dealing with issues of criminal justice or crime. And so the good news is there's new approaches to all of these things. There's new approaches to creating more affordable housing. And so what's really important is that we have an open mind toward innovating, to coming up with new solutions for these problems, because unless we address them, unless people begin to trust that the benefits of growth will somehow accrue to them, then they're going to be opposed to growth. And what's going to happen is we're going to shrink. And when we shrink, the opposite of that virtuous cycle occurs. And you shrink and you then don't have as much money. And when you don't have as much money, you disinvest in making the quality of life in the city better. When that happens, quality of life gets worse, like you talked about with respect to crime, and more people leave. And that's what we can't have happen. Anybody who is old like me remembers that, in the 1970s, New York lost 800,000 people in one decade. We lost 13 Fortune 500 companies in 1 year. The city almost was bankrupt, right? And it took us 25 years to recover from that. So we can't take sort of the good things that we've experienced in New York for granted. But in order to continue that, we're going to have to address some of these imbalances that I've talked about.
So you think it's less about just rebuilding, and it's more about innovating on what's already there and making sure that people who feel marginalized or who feel like they are in the unequally treated groups would kind of get to the state of balance and, equality and equity.
Yeah, again, I probably a little, I don't know what balance means exactly, but the key thing is that people have to believe that this city is rooting for them, right? That it's giving them opportunity, that it's not unfair to them. Doesn't mean everyone has to be given the same opportunities. It just means that people have to feel like the barriers to them having a better life for themselves and their family are starting to actually get tossed out, and that they actually can make a better life.
Well, on that kind of theme of opportunity and barriers coming down, one of the more remarkable things we've seen during the pandemic is not only a shift in where businesses are, but also how businesses operate. And so we've seen a lot of firms tell people, A, you don't need to come into work 5 days a week, 2, 3 days is enough. And B, you can work remotely. We've seen that work for a lot of major institutions. Do you think that that shift might be a driving force in giving people those opportunities and making them feel, you know what, there are more financial groups in the city that now might work for me, but I don't have to commute from Queens or Brooklyn or any borough. I don't have to come in five days a week. That's no longer a problem for me.
I think that might play a bit of a role going forward. But most of the people who live in those outer boroughs are not working for financial firms, for example. They're working in essential jobs. They might be working for the government. They might be, working to make other people's lives easier. That's why they're called essential. But I do think we will see a trend across most businesses and jobs toward greater flexibility. A good question to ask is whether that greater flexibility is a good thing or a bad thing for New York. It's probably not a great thing for real estate in the central business districts like Midtown and downtown. But what it probably means is there'll be more economic activity in the neighborhoods around the city. We've already begun to see that during COVID. And so what you will see is opportunity distributed more broadly across the city, which will probably be some kind of help to people, but doesn't mean we don't have to deal with the underlying issues of how people get around and the other issues like that.
Yeah, and we'll have a question on transportation in a bit. But real quick, I wanted to go back to, we were talking about the people in the bureaus that aren't necessarily working for these financial institutions. And you're right, the majority of these people are working for, restaurants, retail vendors, businesses that have suffered the most under the pandemic. So what should be the government's role to help those businesses who don't have the ability to adapt and recover quickly, who have been seriously hurt by lack of foot traffic, people unable to come into work, and the people just unwilling to go out and spend money?
Well, first of all, the federal government has played a significant role in helping businesses through this crisis. We've now spent $4 billion or will with sort of this new legislation that just passed, $1 trillion, I should say. And a lot of it has gone to small businesses. That said, it's clearly not enough. We're seeing vacancy rates that are higher than any time for retail in a long time. And so I think the city itself can actually help businesses to get back on their feet. I think there's probably creative financing vehicles that the city could deploy to help that, like revolving fund of some sort. The city created a huge amount of affordable housing by having basically its own bank for affordable housing. Something like that for small businesses might be a very interesting idea. I think even Andrew Yang has proposed something like that. So yeah, I think there are things that city can do. The other thing city can do is make it easier to get a new business up and running, and then to keep running. And that means cutting red tape, making it more streamlined to get the approvals that are necessary. So a city can play an important role in that. Cities can also make investments in promoting the city. One of the things that I was really proud of that we did when I was in government was, when we came into government, the amount of tourists was way down because of 9/11. We spent a lot of money to promote the city. We attracted kind of counterintuitive events to the city to promote the city. We made it easier to get hotels built, et cetera. So we're facing a crisis in the tourism industry. We'll see what happens as the vaccine gets widely distributed. But a clever city can make smart investments in specific sectors of the economy where it thinks it either needs to, or it can build an important advantage over other cities. And that will be a very important priority for the next mayor.
And you think we're at a point now in the pandemic where the next administration can focus on those strategic investments without it being a detriment to other ventures?
I think so. I think you have to have a strategy.
Yeah.
You have to think of the city as a competitive entity, right? That's competing with other cities. You have to be self-aware enough to know where you can really compete and where you can't. You have to have a financially driven kind of analysis to understand kind of where you should make investments and where you shouldn't. But all those things can be done. I mean, I know because we did it back, in the wake of 9/11.
Out of curiosity, in the realm of competitiveness, one of the kind of things that's part of it is pushing people away are New York's taxes. And we have, of the major cities in the United States, we have the highest or some of the highest taxes. And it doesn't look like that's going down anytime soon, but it looks like that's actually going to keep going up. Isn't that a major part of what's making people feel either that they don't have opportunity, that the city isn't rooting for them, or just that they should get out and get somewhere else that still has a lot of opportunity, but isn't burdening them with such high taxes?
Well, one of the really interesting issues is taxes, as you point out. Tends to be a big issue for the very small percentage of people, who make the most money.
Right.
And we're highly dependent upon those people. And I think 1% of the people generate something like 40% of the individual taxes collected by New York City. Now, I think most of those people are loyal New Yorkers. They want New York to be successful. What they don't want is to be treated with disrespect and taken advantage of. And I think if a new mayor went to them and said, "Hey, we need your help for the next few years," I think the overwhelming majority would say, "You know what? Some sort of temporary tax increase would be fine." But they got to do it in a way that's respectful and not spiteful, in a way which some of what is happening in Albany looks that way. It's like just penalize the rich. At some point, if taxes get too high, people are going to feel taken advantage of, and enough of them are going to leave that it's going to really hurt the city and will play a role in sending the city into that vicious cycle that we talked about. The thing we got to avoid is the 70s all over again. Right? That's the key.
Yeah.
And said we need to make people feel like they're a part of the solution and that everybody ultimately is going to benefit from those.
That's really interesting. I haven't heard people talk about the rhetoric being used, but I mean, I get it. You see, the trending hashtag is "Eat the Rich." I mean, you see kind of this very inflammatory, aggressive, anti-wealth rhetoric being used, and that's what's fueling these policies. So you think if they spun it in a way where, look, we're only doing this to help the city for X number of years, X number of months, once that's done, it goes back to where it was, you think more people than not are going to be okay with that?
I do. And let's figure out what we need. Let's also not forget we're getting a huge amount of money from the federal government under this COVID relief or stimulus plan that's probably going to enable us to avoid major budgetary issues for the next couple of years. It's going to enable the MTA in the short run to avoid dramatic cuts in service or laying lots of people off. So we first need to understand what the math is. What do we really need? And if in fact there is a real need to kind of rebuild the city, rebuild momentum in the city, I think depending on how it is approached, people will be, very open to playing a part in the recovery. The thing that you always have to remember about New York is that New Yorkers are incredibly proud of their city. They want to play a role in making it greater. And they will do that if they are part of the process. And so I think that's part of why New York has always managed to recover, is of that great pride, but you can't squander it away by being disrespectful. And I think that's something that really needs to be borne in mind.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I'm really glad you brought up the MTA, because that was going to be my next question. Even amongst kids my age who are of relatively low risk from the virus, from them up, we've seen a dramatic kind of shift away from public transportation. People are afraid to use the buses, to use subways. The MTA can't run on federal funds forever. The New York Times put out a report last week saying it's not going to be enough. Whatever money comes from this new bill, it's not enough. How do we get people feeling comfortable and feeling okay with taking public transportation if even the vaccine rolling out doesn't seem to be doing it?
Yeah, but don't forget, the vaccine isn't really rolled out right now, right? So what, 20, 25% of New Yorkers are fully vaccinated at best at this point. It's very hard at, given what we've been through over the last year, to imagine a time when we're all vaccinated, or at least we have the equivalent of herd immunity. So I would be really careful about making judgments at this point. Let's see where we are in July, when by that point, anybody who wants a vaccine will be able to have gotten one, where the pressure on people to get the vaccine, if they haven't, will simply grow. And that'll come from employers and coworkers, that'll come from schools. And I suspect what we will see is a much more rapid recovery than we're assuming right now. But so I just caution against the kind of disaster scenario. The key thing is that we kind of get to the other side without doing damage to the quality of life. I'm reasonably encouraged that we'll have made a lot of progress by the end of the year.
So you think the vaccine will be that push that gets people not back to full normal life, but back to the realm of normal?
Yeah, look, I think normal is obviously a term of art, right? The great thing about New York is it's always changing and evolving. And the reason it has been sort of a capital of the world and the leading city in the United States is because people are optimistic, they look ahead, and they adapt when conditions change. And I suspect New Yorkers, again, who are overwhelmingly an optimistic lot, will adapt in the same way. You got to remember another thing about New York. New York's a city of immigrants. So if you think about it, about 40% of New Yorkers were born outside of America. Another 25%, probably have at least one parent who was born outside of America. There's people like me who grew up somewhere else in the United States and came to New York. The act of immigration is an act of optimism. You got to believe that where you're going is better than where you came from.
Right.
And so what we have in this city is a collection of dreamers and optimists and people who are looking toward the future. And I think generally quickly forget the past. And for the most part, that's a great thing. It's a great thing when you're talking about recovery. So I suspect people will be looking toward the future kind of once the vaccine is widely distributed. Now, the caveat to that, of course, is, we can't predict what happens with variants and whether the vaccines will inoculate against variants. So far, it looks pretty good. But that is a wild card, and it's hard to predict. The one thing that we do have to do, foundational for the recovery, is focus on public health, right? People have to believe that the places that may be at greatest risk are safe, and that's why the MTA is going to continue to spend $300 million a year to clean up the subways in a way they didn't before COVID. We have to send very visible signals that it is safe. And we have to do that substantively, and we have to do that symbolically. And that's going to be very important. After 9/11, sending those signals was really important. So there were bag checks when you went into the subway for a period of time. There were squads of police cars that they're flashing lights that kind of screamed down the boulevards just to let everybody know that, we were vigilant.
Right.
There were police cars on the bridges and, other stuff. We added, I think, 1,200 police officers that were exclusively focused on counterterrorism. And so, there's a lot a city can do to instill confidence, whereas back then it was about public safety in terms of protection against kind of terrorism. It now is about public health. But I will tell you, 2 to 3 years after 9/11, people weren't looking back very much. Clearly, we had to do what we did to memorialize the horrible thing that happened, but New Yorkers look forward, and that is one of our most important strengths.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, you've spoken a lot today and in general on New York's optimism, the importance of keeping people focused on the future. Unfortunately, I think in part due to the media, in part due to our political polarization, a lot of people have lost faith in New York, in America, and have become more pessimistic just about the general state of our nation and our city. How can those in power, those coming into power, get people feeling confident and optimistic about their lives in the city again, emerging from this crisis, emerging from this summer and the past presidency and all of that?
Well, the most important thing is to show momentum, right? So if we start to see growth again, then people are going to start feeling more confident. Confidence builds on confidence. And that's exactly what happened after 9/11. Now, that doesn't mean government can't take specific actions to make people feel more confident or invest in the city. I'll give you another example of something that happened after 9/11. So obviously, it was the World Trade Center that was destroyed. We lost nearly 3,000 people. After 9/11, Lower Manhattan emptied out of residents, right? The vacancy rate, the percentage of people who, of apartments that were vacant went from like 1% to 50% almost overnight. So, what the city did was said, it's important symbolically, it's important to kind of send really important messages about the future of the city to repopulate Lower Manhattan. So using some of the federal money that we got after 9/11, we said, you know what, we're going to pay people to come back to Lower Manhattan. We actually subsidized 50% of the rent for 6 months. You know where that vacancy rate went? It went from like 50% down to 2%.
That's amazing.
In about 2 months. And when those incentives wore off, nobody left.
Right, they stayed.
Right. So again, if you start inspiring confidence, and you can do that through words, you can do that through actions. Obviously, as the economy recovers, you'll see a pretty natural growth in confidence, which will perpetuate sort of the good things happening.
Right. So it requires both actionable policy, but also just positive rhetoric and getting people back.
Confidence, in the Great Depression, Franklin Roosevelt was elected president, and in his inauguration speech, and this was at the very, very depths of the Depression, 25% of Americans were out of work. He said one of the most profound things probably any American president or leader has ever said, which is we got nothing to fear but fear itself, right? It's confidence, and leaders can inspire confidence, and not just political leaders, but others. And if we galvanize sort of that confidence, the natural optimism of New Yorkers, generally speaking, will take over.
So then, thinking big picture, we have an entirely new administration coming in this year. We're going to have primaries, elections. It is kind of that season to get people more engaged. Once a new administration takes over, what can they do specifically to get people ready to build back better? I mean, you and Bloomberg took over after the worst crisis in the city's history, and you helped get New York back on its feet within a couple of months. So it was an incredible turnaround. I don't think anyone has ever managed a crisis to that level of efficiency. We'll be a year and a half out of within COVID. It will be a year and a half out of the pandemic. What should their first steps look like?
Well, first of all, don't forget, most likely all these elected officials are probably going to get elected in June, right?
Yeah.
Because there's a Democratic primary, probably will not be
Right.
a Republican challenger, or if there is, won't be serious. So they're going to have 6 months to prepare. We only had a 2 months, less than 2 months to prepare because the new mayor, the new council, other elected officials take office on January 1st, 2022. And so Mike Bloomberg, as a Republican, was elected in the first week of November, and he had to put together his entire team and get ready to go in less than 2 months. I was not appointed to my position as deputy mayor for economic development and rebuilding until December 28th. Right. So there's a lot of time to prepare. And that, I think, is really important. There's a lot of time to get the team in place. There's a lot of time to develop specific plans. And I said, I think what's really important is that those plans kind of balance inclusion, making people feel like and growth, making people feel like the growth is fair, that we're beginning to address some of the racial inequities or structural inequities in the system itself, acknowledging that the end of the day, that we have to think of ourselves as a competitive entity and being innovative, right? It's innovation at the end of the day that's going to be most important. How do we rethink a lot of the ways we've done things in the past? And if we start innovating in certain places, we start to see some success with that, people will gain greater confidence in sort of our ability to do new things and solve problems in new ways. And, that is what I would hope any new mayor or other elected official would actually focus on.
And most importantly, you're feeling confident and optimistic about the future of the city.
I do. I said, people have counted this city out over and over and over again, and it always bounces back. But it's leadership and creativity that determines how quickly that's going to happen. If you think just since 2000, in the last 20 years, we've had 9/11, we had the financial crisis, we had Superstorm Sandy, and now we've had COVID. In the first three of those cases, everybody said, New York will never bounce back. After the financial crisis, people said, when you look at history, New York always bounced back slower than the rest of the country. If you look at Superstorm Sandy, who would ever buy property in these low-lying areas? You know what? In all those cases, New York came back. And so this may be a little more complicated. The changes in the city will probably be more significant in many ways, but with good leadership and a commitment of everybody to work together to pull us out of it, we'll come back.
All right. Well, thank you so much. That's a good place to end things on. It was great talking to you.
It was really fun talking to you too, Jordan.